Ladies and gentlemen, John Manzella.
Economics, demographics, and technology have a tremendous impact on labor. We're talking about demand, availability, wages, and when I talk about availability, I'm talking about individual people as well as skill sets. Skills on the very high level, skills on the very low level. There's a whole series of new drivers on the horizon. Green industries, clouds, tablets, smartphones, hydraulic fracturing, 3D printing, nanotechnology, biotechnology. These are tremendous drivers of growth. As we all know, the baby boom generation, if you were born between 46 and 64, is aging and retiring. We're talking about huge numbers of people. But the biggest problem is when they retire, they take their skills with them. In manufacturing, when people see the statistic and they see that employment is likely to continue dropping, people automatically default to the assumption that the manufacturing sector must be hollowed out. And if I was to go down the street and survey 5 people and say, what do you think of manufacturing? The vast majority would tell me it's being hollowed out. But it's really not. When you take a look at why manufacturing jobs decline, the real reason is U.S. innovation, technology, and productivity. So U.S. is one of the few advanced nations that actually has a population growth rate, a positive growth rate. If you look at Europe, it's neutral or negative. Countries like Russia or Italy have a negative growth rate. So what does that mean? That means there's fewer consumers and there's fewer producers. The U.S. has a positive growth rate, which is really good for the economy moving forward. And much of that's due to immigration. But the important point here is this. U.S. educational system attracts the best and the brightest in the world. If you then take those people and you educate them, and then you send them back home to compete against us, that's really a failed immigration policy, especially when we think about this at Silicon Valley. A few years ago, the stats were this, that half the CEOs and half the lead technicians were foreign-born. So again, today's jobs really require deeper skill sets and the ability to do a whole number of things. Think critically and solve analytical problems. You look at younger workers entering the force. It's very difficult to find people with these skills. Manipulate sophisticated technology. If you walk into a manufacturing facility, a textile facility, it almost seems as though you've got to be an engineer to work some of the machinery. It's so sophisticated. And especially in the hotel industry, finding younger people that can articulate with social grace is a real challenge. Think about this. 600,000 manufacturing jobs went unfilled last year because manufacturers couldn't find the skilled labor, and unemployment was close. The question is, did more people actually enter the labor force? Well, I would argue that the unemployment rate really is understated. In fact, if you just talk about the unemployment, so what strategies can you implement to attract and retain more employees? The abundance of land or raw materials pretty much provided that country with a competitive advantage. Today, skills are really the only sustainable competitive advantage. And the number one challenge, you've got to provide more training. I think companies in all sectors will have to invest much, much more in lifelong learning. This is an amazing statistic that 70% of the youth in Switzerland are involved in apprenticeship programs. 65% in Germany, 55% in Austria. So I think moving forward, we really have no choice. When you're talking about young people, you're talking about incentives with tangible short-term benefits. It no longer works where you can talk to an entry-level employee or somebody new on the payrolls and say, in 3 years, you're going to get this promotion, or in 2 years, you're going to get that. They want to know what I'm going to be getting next month or next Tuesday. Politics is polarized. And there's many reasons why it's polarized, but think of this. About 60% of congressional districts are gerrymandered to the point where the incumbent is likely to win re-election regardless of what position they choose because it's a safe district. So they can stake out positions on the far left or they can stake out positions on the far right and know with a good deal of certainty they're going to get re-elected. The problem with this approach is they don't appeal to the center. It's much more difficult to compromise. Polarization continues, gridlock continues. The European Union represents 71% of foreign direct investment into the U.S. And they're also the destination of 21% of U.S. exports. So any issues in Europe have a huge impact on this side of the Atlantic. And think about this. The southern European countries haven't implemented any legislation to enhance competitiveness in decades. As a result, southern Europe has an unemployment rate which is about twice as high as the north. Southern Europe really never adapted to globalization, which was the subject of my last book. And future free trade agreements are unlikely to include developing countries. I wrote a couple books on NAFTA and other agreements. And I believe that they provide a good deal of kick in terms of these economies, but the developing economies really didn't reciprocate in many ways in the past. So they're likely to be shut out. What's happening in China? Labor rates are up 18% a year on average. When you factor in the rise of the renminbi, the Chinese currency, you're talking about labor rates now 20 to 25%. If you then factor in, and I was talking to Jonathan with this earlier, longer lead times, larger inventories, duties to get your components in China, quality control issues, the cost of sending engineers to China or India or Pakistan. So you're beginning to see a lot of products that were offshored moving back to the US. The Chinese Academy of Social Sciences is a client of mine, so I spent time, and they're the government think tank. And at my recent visit, they talked about one of their stimulus packages and how they didn't have as many political concerns as the US stimulus package had. And as a result, their stimulus package was much more effective. And in the past, they looked at the US system, a free market capitalism. I think they looked at the US system with awe. But because the recession began in the US, a lot of our faults have been exposed. And the Chinese, to a much greater extent, feel that their system is superior. I personally think that there's serious problems with the Chinese system, and they're going to incur these over the next several years. Germany has the highest median age of the world. So 46.5. So that means half the population is older than that, and half is younger. Japan is second. The US comes in with 37.3. So what does all of this mean? Well, if you're a manufacturer of games, say computer games, electronic games, you want to focus on those countries with the lowest median age. If you're a hotel, America's energy revolution. It's changing absolutely everything in terms of manufacturing. So advanced horizontal drilling, hydraulic fracturing, has enabled companies to extract gas and oil from reserves that we never really paid attention to because in the past they were too difficult to get to. You couldn't access certain reserves because the cost was prohibitive. But because of this new technology, you can now access these reserves, and you can do it affordably. So now, the Marcellus Shale, which I basically live on, is tremendous. We're looking at 141 trillion cubic feet of gas. Now, nobody knows what 141 trillion cubic feet of gas is, but let me mention this. That's the amount of consumption that will be demanded around the world in 10 years. So what is this all going to do to manufacturing? It's going to bring down the cost of products that just can't be automated. And we're talking about quite a few products. Bangladesh, India, Thailand, Vietnam. A lot of the production that was done in China is moving to those next low-cost producers. It's like we're also looking at an opposite trend called nearshoring. So what's happening is a good number of companies want to establish facilities, whether they're manufacturing, whether they're sales operations, whether they're warehousing. They want to locate those facilities as close as possible to their fastest growing markets. How important are currency risks? Well, whether you're establishing or investing in a hotel in India, or you're purchasing product, political risk is tremendous, and we're seeing the assumptions that were given, say 5 years ago, no longer. In the US, we really have a secret sauce that no other country, I believe, has. We have a system of free market capitalism. We have a can-do spirit here. We've got entrepreneurialism, really like no other country in the world. Innovation in the US is tremendous. We still spend considerably much more in R&D than the next highest spender. Capital markets, although they function in odd ways sometimes, overall they're very strong. We've got a brilliant constitution with checks and balances, separation of church and state, rule of law. We really have a secret sauce that I believe will keep the U.S. on top for generations to come. So